Man, this is embarrassing to make a further recording. I'm going to have to call it something like a Concise-er or addendum to answering the andromadist question. But this is just a. I didn't explicitly say this, I guess, but I mean, this is to outline and give an overview of what I've already said on the matter, and to add a little bit more descriptive mass as a kind of as a big just label or whatever that I still stand by. That essentially it's a formula. It's a formula that works on having scapegoats and having an external locus of control, so that it can get away with a kind of rationalism that is essentially that intellectual sort of exercise is not really what it's about. What it's about is projecting your own expectations that the environment that is impregnated with this narrative is an open canvas for you to gainsay, is an open canvas for you to sort of extract and demand from the ether, because it's woven out of the integrity of the scapegoat that you can kind of imagine should have already used their time machine to fix your problem of history that should have already been solved, so that you wouldn't have to make your grievance visible and express it overtly, that it should have already been taken care of. And so you've kind of, that's the kind of maybe the resentment mechanics working there as well. But it means that essentially you don't have to underwrite your own manifestation of your own values, because you don't have values. You just have to have a scapegoat. You just have to have a resentment. You don't actually have to have a positive, affirmative worldview. You have a reactive worldview that's built out of the guilt of the ideological scapegoat. So it's not about the ideology. It's about the parasitic attachment to the scapegoat, as it were. And so that's what it fundamentally is. That's what it is structurally. But the added description that is worth tacking onto that is to relate it, or to point at the connotation of how this is similar to feminism, of how this has been present within second wave feminism. Ever since second wave feminism had this toxic element in it, and there is something about so I'm just going to make some general remarks about this and elaborate this point about how it relates to feminism, but and the reasons why it is that it's correct to associate it with feminism, although structurally it's not exactly the same thing, which is why you could argue that Nazism explicitly made this alliance with a kind of feminine ideological. What made the Nazi movement popular was the cultural fad that was set by women, predominantly. Women made the Nazi movement what it was. It made it popular. Because it was a culture that pandered to them and that they could understand. It had an emotional fabric. It had the cultural narrative matrix which the Nazi ideology provided was something that So I'm going to talk about this point of calling this a kind of feminine politics, or a female version of politics, which the reason why I would associate it with femininity, or is essentially because of the differences between the sexes in terms of their uh, optimal sexual strategies. Men and women are most different in terms of the different constraints that deal with reproduction, which tend towards promoting different forms of, or they end up tending towards promoting different parameters for success and different points of concern or worry, because the different sexes are vulnerable to different failure modes. And eggs are expensive and sperm is cheap. And a long story short, essentially, all societies that privilege women, that protect women, that confer on them a basic kind of sanctity and ensure a kind of some kind of enshrined respect and biological value that women hold for the group, do better than societies and groups that do not provide these special benefits. Because a group that tends towards male disposability as against female disposability will, in the long term, never diminish. Because if you lose men or males to war with the tribe that you're warring against, but you conserve all the lives of your female population, in a generation you don't feel the loss, essentially. It doesn't, in terms of all other things being equal, technology of war being equal, groups that preserve the health of their female section of the population do better. So you end up creating conditions that end up precipitating a societal compact, a kind of and within this dynamic, you end up with something like male disposability, and I mean this is added to the selective pressure that males have had to endure. This is why there are so many more male geniuses, but then also so many more male idiots, because there's a lot of pressure for the male expression of genetics or whatever to be the perfect generational, to hit the sweet spot, and they have to be appropriate because and I mean, in some sense, this is because men, I mean, the let's say the actual lineage of our species bears this out. Men at twice the rate of women do not propagate their genes to the next generation. So 80% of all women, I mean, this is a bit of a generalization, but we know genetically that basically twice the number of women as men are in the ancestry. So in every generation, something like 20% of women don't reproduce. And a lot of that is simply because of a kind of biological, let's say, abnormality, or female reproductive health is a lot more fragile and also susceptible to issues like a lot more things can kind of go wrong, whereas males, not for their own biological deficiency in the lineage of the history of our species, they don't have the societal status. They don't have they don't have the merit. Uh, uh, they don't have the success within their social structure um, to have the opportunity to pass their genes on. So there's always been this kind of slow genocide against men who can't prove their value to the group and who can't trade in their high social status, which is essentially the only, I mean, this is how the patriarchy essentially works, is that and women just have to position themselves, and this is why women have to track opportunity costs very stringently. If a woman chooses to use her free time to associate with one group of people rather than another group of people, she always has to contrast the opportunity cost. Well, I'm making myself available to this pool of people, and I would say that the most successful cultures are ones in which there is a certain equalizing parity between the sexes, where people can actually marry people eventually from their own peer group, that they're not just looking for a hypergamous, sort of windfall, that they're, because I mean, that's also what happens when people enter into relationships or marry people who are years older than them. They are effectively inheriting. I mean, if you look at the model of marriage as having a joint estate, as two people with their separate individual estates forming a joint collective estate and ownership, the older partner is diluting their investment with the younger partner. So the bigger the age gap, I mean, this is a bit of a generalization, and this is meant to be sort of an overview of how hypergamy occurs, and what it's targeting essentially, is that it pays for a woman to make themselves available to high status men, and in some sense, it's not as if these women, these perhaps young women, are not bringing anything to the table. What they're bringing to the table is their biological capital. So essentially, women have this, let's say, boon to their social standing, and that value depreciates the older that they get. It wanes, it dissipates. And the point of me getting into this, it just means that when a woman is a young post-puberty, sort of sexually, a woman who is in the sexual marketplace at a young age is almost at the zenith of her appeal in the sexual marketplace, and she can get drunk on that attention and on that power. Essentially, she can sort of have a bit of a delusional framing of reality, thinking that this is the norm, that everyone deserves free drinks because she gets offered so many free drinks whenever she goes out. That this is sort of the default of how everything should function according to those kinds of rules. And hypergamy is that kind of sentiment, is essentially that male energy is not only disposable, but it's there to be exploited, and and this is seen as almost like a kind of societal social groove, that it is the norm to exploit or to anyway. So the point of me saying this is essentially just to say that when we understand something like the concept of the social contract, when we understand something like the concept of the individual and integrity, the archetypal visage of such a, what should be the lowest common, what should be the standard bearer for this moral idiom? Well, it can't be the female archetype. It has to be the male archetype. We have to understand that the basic constituent of society is a basic sort of masculine. Now, when I say this, I don't mean to affirm the point that Sam Vaknin makes. I think Sam Vaknin is point that women have become a unigender, that women have become just like men. I disagree with that thesis. I mean, there's a version of that kind of works, but it's not. I'm not endorsing that view. Women are modeling them. You could say Sam Vaknin makes the point that women are modeling themselves after psychopathic men or narcissistic men. That's closer to the truth, but that's not what I'm talking about. Saying that the basic constituent of society needs to be archetypally understood as male and not as female. And I would even argue that the kind of political appetite that people have, that their identity must be bestowed with a kind of automatic integrity or pride or dignity that must just be bestowed onto them, which is a fundamental paradox. How can integrity be bestowed? It's either entrenched in basic values and an understanding of that, but they want a narrative that dons it, that awards it to them, that grants it to them. So it's this kind of, there's this fundamental sort of dependence on a kind of external cultural enforcement monitoring agency service. Which I also think is essentially why we see so much policing of morality, but the bad kind of moral policing in terms of policing moral codes and conventions, because you need vacuous structure that isn't based in values and principles, so that you can use those hollow conventions as part of the shell game in order to be able to label people as prejudiced or bigots, or sort of not being inclusive and diversive, and kick them off the platform. And all of those are ways in which the people can insulate their grift. They can insulate their relativistic, subjective projection of expectation, and they need access to their scapegoat. They need to continually be attached to the scapegoat, and they can't countenance, they can't tolerate people who deprive them of being able to project onto the scapegoat. And again, I think that this is connected with my concept that we have shifted our gear from the understanding that the basic constituent of society in terms of integrity, in terms of morality, must be conceived of archetypally as male, that has switched to female. And so, these women who model themselves after so-called psychopathic men in Sam Vaknin's description, they aren't viewing themselves as they wouldn't label themselves as like psychopathic men. They wouldn't label themselves as even being a member of the unigender. I think that Sam Vaknin's description plays much into their own rhetoric of these kinds of ideologically possessed people. It's much more like that they don't even recognize themselves as being psychopathic. They obviously see themselves as being self-righteous and sort of sanctimonious, because they are representing their narrative. They're representing their ideology. This is a mind-forged manacle. It's not a persona. The persona is a symptom of the intellectual credence which is being pandered to by things like Twitter and Facebook, creating the nebulous rules that are quite frankly hideous. They are embarrassing. They are disgusting. I mean, you have, you know, vague criteria that it's impossible to know if you've broken the rules or not. It's obviously designed so that some ideologue can use their interpretation to paint you as whatever they want to paint you as, because they have no basic values and principles that they're reasoning from. They have a narrative. And so this is a kind of a narrative inception. That's what it is. It's a so again, my solution to this is to insist on morality, insist on integrity, insist on basic values and principles, and setting up institutions that have such things so that we can exclude these people and that we can start to demarcate cultural space and institutions that are free of this kind of moral toxicity, because these people are fundamentally incredibly toxic, and the only way that we can start to actually make that clear is to demarcate and segregate ourselves from them culturally. Especially this needs to be done on the level of universities. Anyway, but just my point here is that this, I mean, look, everyone has, I believe that everyone has to have stereotypes in their mind. They have to be morally conscious that they don't use stereotypes in a repugnant way, but everyone has to have a low resolution map of reality, and you have to essentially understand that society only works if people engage in it in a certain kind of professionalism and with a certain kind of integrity, which is almost archetypally male. And rules need to be reasoned, and they need to be grounded in basic values, and they need to be made to live up to certain basic, almost natural notions of natural justice, etc., etc. Not just reasonableness and rationality, but anyway. I think I've made all the points that I was going to make. So my point about this is is just to say that historically we can see that this ideology didn't come out of nowhere. It grew out of feminist theory. And I think that, and I've basically given the case as to my sociological diagnosis as to why that is, and that is in almost for archetypal, somewhat reasons, and I gave my whole sort of sociological analysis of that issue, I guess, or my sort of slightly psychological analysis of it. So, I mean, again, this is why I think it's important to be a non-sexualist and to be a non-racialist. That is not to say that there aren't differences between races and that there aren't differences between sexes, but those differences are basically morally irrelevant, because it doesn't matter what a group generalization has as a different medium or a different average than some other group. It doesn't matter, because we engage in life on the level of the individual. And yes, as individuals, we all have, let's say, some kind of running impression, or some kind of, we make generalizations in our mind all the time, and we can't stop making generalizations. But we just simply have to understand the moral I mean, not only the moral, but the you know the problem of giving way to sort of statistical interpretations of reality is to sort of subsume yourself into a narrative, and narratives lose sight of agency and self-determinism and self-ownership. You all of that gets totally dissolved in things like statistics. Like you can't. I mean, you can use statistics and you can use generalizations to answer morally neutral questions, like where would you be willing to put yourself at a certain place at a certain time of night, you know, and the answer to that question will be purely based on low resolution generalizations that populate your mind. But it's essentially a morally neutral question, how you've used those generalizations to derive that answer. It's morally irrelevant. It doesn't have a moral charge attached to it. Now, obviously, I think the identitarians would make a different claim. They think that no, you're not allowed to have generalizations. In fact, you have to adopt their new generalizations as a way to bring equilibrium. That's really what it's about. It's about that you can't discern reality as an individual. You need the ideological computation to supplement for your group crime, your quota of systemic injustice that you need to collectively bear as an identitarian faction in this sort of drama between the pantheon of these characters. But again, that is also a bit of a smokescreen, because it really is just about having a conduit for people to imagine a better world that they can access through this kind of hypothetical revolutionary imagination that is essentially built out of the vengeance that is imagined being done to the scapegoat. So it's sort of it's this sort of sadistically edged psychopathic I actually think that the people that gravitate towards this ideology are ones in which this is the preferred mode. Because, first of all, when you intellectualize or pseudo-intellectualize in this formula, it's never your fault. It's the fault of the scapegoat. And the scapegoat also has this kind of weird kind of power, because in some sense they are the only locus of agency in the entire system. So it's weird because that even within this dynamic, the scapegoat has this is the source of a kind of there's something about the scapegoat that has to be replicated. I mean, it's an interesting mirror that happens. For example, in the Nazi conspiracy theory, the Jews infiltrated the Aryan psychology, infiltrated the minds of the Aryans, and also infiltrated the financial system, infiltrated the banks, infiltrated all sectors of society and thinking. And if you look at how the Nazi states operate, the Nazi has essentially a planned economy, controls industry very tightly, almost a kind of something that's very similar to conscription of industry, controls the money, the finance, the banking very tightly, and controls the propaganda and the thought control of the culture So everything that the scapegoat was doing, the Nazi was also needing to do in order to ostensibly react to what the scapegoat had done. The scapegoat had infiltrated the mind of the Aryan, so the Nazi state has to thought control in order to correct it. So the accusation against the scapegoat becomes the license to perpetrate the same thing, because it becomes a necessary reactive intervention, a necessary defensive reaction. So there's this almost preemptive projection that because you have to preemptively project onto the perpetrator what it is that you are wishing to deploy and advance. And again, this is somewhat part of the mechanistic nature of how the formula. Now, the formula in terms of identity politics is much more tangible, because when you have a tangible scapegoat, if you name the scapegoat, it's not just an esoteric abstraction like free will or the illusion of free will. Like Sam Harris's scapegoat is the illusion of free will, but if it's an actual, like Russell Brand will say it's the 1%. The identitarians will say it's white and it's male. They can all indulge in their private fawning over their own cradled deficiency and their own cradled wounds of grievance and their own particular. So they don't have to substantiate the claim, but they know who has to sign the check, essentially, and the person who has to, they all agree on who has to sign the check. The person who has to sign the check is male and or white. And so as long as that there's a broad coalition of agreement that those are the people who have to sign the blank check, and they have to accede to whatever accusation is put against them, then there doesn't have to be agreement amongst those who cradle their own private grievances or their own factional. So there can be a kind of an assumed silent cohesion between the various disparate victim classes, or everyone who isn't white/male, white or male. Now, this whole system is somewhat untenable, and my general thesis is that this is just all proto-fascist. Hitler would have called these people useful idiots because they have the format and the formula of the Nazi worldview, but they haven't picked a very clear partisan. They haven't gotten into practical politics. They haven't gotten into essentially admitting that you can't have a rainbow Hitler. You can only have a Hitler that represents and is the Führer, is the savior, that's what Führer means, of one identitarian faction. So the idea that you can have a multilateral approach means that the only thing that you can agree about is who is the scapegoat. You can't agree about actually how to solve the problem. You can only agree who has to write the check. But anytime you want to sort of try to reduce the unknown quantity into a tangible figure, into an actual quantifiable element, the whole thing is going to be like herding cats. The whole thing is going to collapse unless you stop being a proto-fascist and you evolve into a particular chauvinistic or sort of ethno-nationalism, and then you start actually getting, then you become sort of the full-blown Nazi. And or there is an alternative, or you become a kind of full-blown feminist, where you are chauvinistic around the feminine identity. And that's what we have in this current, let's say, constellation of this sort of circus camp, because it's not, it's not a full-blown fascist totalitarian surge. It is a hodgepodge, sort of quilt of different factions under the same circus tent. And they will frustrate each other, and they will cannibalize each other. And I would think that the feminists will be around for a very, very long time, because that is, let's say, one of the only stable coalition points. The female identity gives them the solidity, gives them a kind of beachhead from which to continue to make skirmishes and extend and outreach, sort of intersectional tendrils into trying to derange and discombobulate the culture, and just a kind of unsettle it enough to create enough of a kind of contrived conflagration that is a kind of war of attrition, which is why my counsel is not to engage in the culture war, but to industriously work towards containing it and demarcating cultural territory and extricating yourself from the culture war by setting up institutions, setting up principled value, structures that keep themselves clean and that can actually protect themselves, and that can create maybe even a kind of legal precedence around keeping those institutions clean. And that will be the easiest sort of clarion call towards having a cleaner culture and having a stable, demarcated space. And I think that is that is seeing the head of Medusa in the reflection of the Aegis, Paris's shield, if I've got the mythology correct. Is that there's no point in confronting it face to face. You're just playing into its. You are exposing blood for this parasite to drink. But yeah, I think it essentially is the Hydra. In that's what I think proto-fascism is. It is the formula. It's not the specific. It doesn't have a particular true character or true name. It is essentially just the sort of the formula of depending on an external locus of control. Because then you have a kind of invulnerable epistemological reliabilism, and you never have to be an epistemic agent and endorse your own values. You never have to have affirmative values. You can just kind of live a defiant, reactive mentality. You can live out your reactive mentality without any... I mean, it comes with its own sort of different costs to your life, but there's a sort of hypothetical invulnerability to it. There's a kind of there's a permanent there's an automatic claim that you get to indulge in, that you get to demand a kind of integrity instead of having to earn it, that you can just expect to extract what you want. And I mean, you still have to do, let's say, the emotional work of the emotional blackmail and the moral hostage taking by incepting someone into the narrative. So it's not as if it's sort of it's comes with nothing, but there's sort of, you don't really have any of your epistemic agency. You don't have any of your own skin in that game. It's all it's a kind of collective mob mentality bandwagon that you get to rely on in the process. And so you can just basically say, well, I was misled. You can just basically say, well, I was trying to be responsible. I believed in the rhetoric. You can make these excuses, the kind of excuses that you can imagine the Nazi generals said in the high command, before they were hanged in the Nuremberg trial, just following orders, that they were exalting this model of how order functions. The narrative scapegoat. And again, this is a good substitute. This is a good indulgence. That means that you don't have to grow up in your own maturity, in your own psychological development. Because instead of going on a personal self-actualization, sort of journey and growing up, you can essentially invent the idea that it's the world that needs to change. It's the world that's holding you back. It's your environment that is not conferring to you the status that you deserve to be bestowed. That the structure of the unjust system needs to be upgraded. And I believe that this is essentially also inculcates within it a further encroachment, further encroaching denigration on the very concept of justice. That justice is completely uninvented and absorbed into this narrative monstrosity and sort of Ponzi scheme and House of Cards. So I mean, I do actually think that the system does need to be upgraded as well, but I think it needs to be upgraded with values and principles. So that we are in line for a revamp, as it were. And that also parallels to my point about Nietzsche and Christianity, which I don't want to repeat because it's it's a bit too long of a thesis to retell, but I said in the last recording where it can be found in the last recording of my answering Andromedist. It's sort of in the last, somewhere probably in the last 4 hours of the 8-hour recording. This is a further addendum. I'm going to continue to elaborate on this theme around the sexual politics of this formula and of this movement of the wokeism. And this, in some sense, I don't think exactly correlates to the spiritual mechanisms that it is using, which are, I think it's a rather generic mechanism. But what I'm about to comment on is essentially the kind of the sociological, cultural reproduction of this movement, how it actually functions in culture, how it actually transmits like a virulent sort of mind virus. And essentially, women or girls, females are very much part of this. And essentially it's because of one of the targets, one of the prime scapegoats, or not the prime, but essentially one of the other face of the prime scapegoat being white, but the secondary scapegoat being male, is that for this kind of narrative witchcraft to function in a culture, you have to offer its proponents or its advocates, you have to give them some kind of power. You have to give them, you have to show how it facilitates their ability to deploy expectations onto people. And so you need a kind of readily available way of making it, convenient and conducive for its proponents to use this. And so one of the things is that perhaps more so than race is that gender is a rather ubiquitous, half of the population roughly is male. So if you've sort of culturally embedded the convention that male sexuality and male personal preferences, people as males aren't allowed to express, sort of standards or have any kind of aren't allowed to express any kind of preference, that all their preferences have to be diminutively subordinate to an ideological program, which really has to do with exploiting and redirecting and dictating and prescribing to males how they need to reform their preferences in order to be the counteracting sort of vector of engineering and equilibrium in the category system and in the narrative matrix. So you are forcing males to burden their, let's say, their natural or organic inclinations and preferences, that they have to subsume that under a kind of ideological reprogramming or re-education. And in some sense, this becomes such an enticing way for predominantly females to deflect any kind of pressure that they might otherwise bear on their own character development. That they don't, instead of having to say, okay, well, I don't meet a certain masculine standard because the boys seem to already be working at this, and I shouldn't have to because the reason why I'm appearing not to do well is because they have created a toxic environment and they have to accommodate me. So you can always kind of, instead of putting pressure on yourself, you can redirect it onto the cultural structure, the systemic environment that is being propped up by the imagined role that how this structure is designed by men for men or something like that. And as I've tried to explain earlier, that women and girls have a much lower tolerance because they have a much, in some aggregate, this is a bit of a generalization, but they have a much greater reservoir of biological capital that they are just granted from the cultural structure, as it were. So in some sense, they are being hobbled by the fact that they have a female privilege, and because they've normalized this female privilege, they have a distorted view of society. They have distorted expectations, and they are just merely homogenizing and evening out that privileged position. And instead of being conscious of this and then realizing, well, it's actually in my interest to develop a culture, to develop a real characterological integrity and mature and develop, and instead of using this, let's say, cultural boon of having this extra societal command and social capital and sort of these weird kinds of ways of having this extra status, instead of treating that with some kind of sensitivity and maturity, they instead indulge into exploiting it in the kind of hypergamous, vector of a exploitative sexual strategy that are open to females. And that means that you have to have very superficial conventions and standards which aren't grounded in values and principles. But anyway, let me not repeat myself. So you have this kind of mechanism, and now you have created an ideology which is basically facilitating that hypergamous exploitative facet of the female sexual strategy, and you've kind of you've put it on steroids. You've given it every kind of structural, cultural hegemony that you can possibly imagine. You've dignified it, and it's not capable of sort of reality checking itself. Also because it is attacking the very thing that would perhaps be a counterbalance to it or be a check on it. So it's preemptively insulating itself from correcting itself in any kind of reality check. But essentially, the vector of how it imagines its utopia is that it's imagining its utopia out of the male disposability that it projects onto things like male sexuality, like the preferences that men have or that boys have or that males have, is just an ingredient in the sausage blender of the sausage factory of their new culture, of their new vision of society. And so it's very easy to imagine a better world if you can dehumanize half the population and you can sort of subsume all of their preferences and as a kind of as a scapegoat. And I would say that there is something worrisome about the hypergamous sort of sexual strategy, is that it has always been parasitic to structural conventions and tokens of high status, because there's something about hypergamy which is a kind of externalization of accountability. That's how it works at exploiting male energy, is that it treats itself as its own infant. Very much like the Lolita complex. The you can see this in the film Lolita after the book. I can't remember the name of the book, but anyway. That it's something like the female's own sexual strategy is her own infant. And she has, these two valences, that in one thing she pretends to be this grown up, sexually mature chooser and adult. And then in the next second, in another valence, she is completely infantilized relative to the structure of the system. And if anything doesn't turn out in terms of positive consequences, well, it's because somebody else gave her the wrong impression. Somebody else induced her into prejudicing her own interests. And so there's always this abrogation of self-ownership and responsibility. So it sort of has this kind of manipulative. It's this kind of manipulative, performative actor. And if the manipulation results in a substandard outcome, then that's offloaded onto the scapegoat. Now, I've already said that in some sense, this I think this is roughly the borderline model, and this is roughly the formula that all fascistic political structures that depend on conspiracy theories and unilaterally dictate reality as a narrative that they get to furnish with their relativistic subjective impressions of things. And as long as they never have to put that unilateral extolling and gainsaying about reality in any kind of dialogue, in any kind of, it's always a one-way flow of a unilaterally dictated narrative, and it just never ends. It never actually receives a message, and then it has to be responsible for receiving any feedback to what they're putting out. It's always a unidirectional sort of stream of consciousness that never gets interrupted. And this probably has an archetypal similarity to the idea of the devouring mother. Discordia, Eris. And there are some positive aspects to Eris or Discordia when you reject an order because you actually have a hope that there's an alternative, that there is actually there's a higher synthesis of order. And so you reject the male suitors because you have a higher standard. You want some kind of masculine offer that is of a higher quality, of a higher caliber. But if you are just if you're just rejecting masculine models of order in a blanket fashion across the board, in which case you're not, it's not that you're holding out for a particular target of a particular order and what it should look like, it's that you are actually addicted to the process of the diminution of masculine energy, the deconstruction and demolishing of masculine structures of order, that your standard that you want is that you want almost a kind of I mean this in a kind of archetypal sense, but you're looking at a kind of homosexual bond with another eros, so that you can both compete with each other about how well you trouse and demolish masculine structures of order, that you're in a kind of pissing match of how malevolent and misanthropic you can be, essentially, because you don't have any fundamental appreciation for, let's say, the fundamental synergy between the masculine and the feminine, which would be something like that. The healthy aspect of Eros only makes sense if there is some window of opportunity for there to be some kind of harmonia, if for there to be some kind of integrated synthesis of some kind of collaborative collateral support between the archetypal aspects, but instead we've got something like a double negative that is pretending to be multiplied with each other to average out into some kind of positive, but it actually doesn't. Two eroses sort of compounding each other, it's just a kind of negative spiral vortex into a kind of oblivion and void. And this is what is essentially, I think, being played out, sort of in the hyperrealism and the, sort of inflationary nature of the fascistic propaganda that you get in the Nazi regime, that it gets more and more delusional, gets more and more strangely esoteric. Now, I'll just say as well that although that this is, let's say, this is happening, it's using this sexual dynamic to some degree, but I'll just point out that it's not women that are necessarily prompting this. It's also, there are boys and men who are cerebral histrionics, who are like the in the world of narcissistic sort of psychology, people have come up with little names and little almost archetypal ways of describing these things, that they call them flying monkeys. And that is a reference from the Wizard of Oz, that the flying monkeys are the henchmen of the Wicked Witch. And so the flying monkeys, I take, are the cerebral histrionics. They are the ones who like creating the intellectual backbone, the intellectual credentials for the movement, because they can play armchair philosophers, they can toy with concocting rationalization, but they are just sort of filling in the intellectual lacunas that they are so it becomes, it's more than just a single, as a movement, it's a kind of it's a one, it seems like it's one kind of animal, but it's actually a composite of a bit of a sort of psychopathologies that have a kind of internal ecosystem in which that they are symbiotically supporting each other because they're creating a successful cultural hegemon. So there's that aspect to all of this. So it's it's kind of like wolves hunt in packs, kind of. That's what I'm basically trying to describe. And I would say that all of these people are psychopathic, but they're psychopathic in different ways, and in ways that complement each other to facilitate them hunting as a pack, as it were. But this is these are perennial themes. These are psychopathologies which have always existed in all cultures, in all societies, in all times. The question is the current cultural hegemon capable of suppressing them? Is it capable of creating enough of a transparent cultural let's say, safety net that clearly identifies and teaches in each generation to identify these elements as being pathological. And if this particular lesson, if this particular kind of education is missing, and if you have, in some sense, the opposite of it, if you have a kind of perverse indoctrination, I do think that we've seen these cycles in history. We've seen them in Nazi Germany, Weimar Germany, going into Nazi Germany. That we haven't gotten a handle on these things because we haven't grown in a sophisticated enough, let's say, psychological grasp of these things. But I mean, they have also been controlled in other epochs and other ways. When we had sanatoriums, when we used to extract borderline females from the population and put them away from the influence, away from being able to influence their own children even. And by the way, I think that there's a large argument to be had that Hitler's mother was probably borderline personality disordered. I believe she was in a sanatorium, and I believe that although Hitler was raised by his aunt, who might have also been somewhere on the sort of cluster B kind of spectrum herself, but I think it is quite likely that Hitler did have contact with his mother, and he perhaps sympathized with his mother. And I speculate that part of his development of the Nazi ideology was trying to create a political, social compact that a borderline woman would have been able to fit in and orientate themselves within the confines thereof, that they would have actually been I think that he used borderline personality disorder as a model, and he co-opted it and turned it into a political ideology. But anyway, I'm not going to fully, I've kind of thematically gone into the components of that already, but I'm not going to spend more time on that thread. But that's basically what I see happened. I don't know. This is going to get very broad if I start trying to connect this with Marxism. But I think that I think I'm much more sympathetic with Marx, and I also think that in Marx's own writings, you can divide Marx into, let's say, the kind of the political sympathy that he ended up providing to the people that he tried, at least for some time, not to have any sympathy with. Marx sets himself up as a theoretician, and he almost makes it a great point of pride that he's not a utopian communist, and he's not interested in that, and that his theory is really quite pristine. Notwithstanding, the aphorisms like, philosophers interpret the world in many ways. The point is to change it. That kind of flies in the face of the point that I just made. But as a theoretician, I think Marx is even tentative about his own his own theoretical construction and his own hypothesis, which still remains only to be a hypothesis, and I would argue a hypothesis to be radically revamped and informed about sort of the kind of experiences. But I mean, the theory that he originally places out is quite what's the word? Is quite humble about it. That essentially that he puts in many places that he might be entirely wrong about a lot of things, especially in any of the things that relate to prediction. But mainly they're to do with cultural constraints, because he tries to circumscribe his focus into, let's say, the material necessity of some kind of transcendental mode of production. But the big question is that, well, history and culture essentially is the is sort of the black box, is the mystery component in this, and that needs to be resynthesized, the poverty of philosophy essentially is probably the greatest missing component in the general sort of poverty of philosophy. That we must at least say that there are lots of warning signs around Marx's own thinking, that his philosophy is not nearly robust enough or broad enough to be useful without radical revamping and reevaluation. But again, I'd like to be somewhat generous to him in that he did put huge caveats on his own work. So I'd just like to draw attention to that. But then if you reassess Marx's contribution and you look at history and how these things have been deployed and how they've also been radically adapted as well. Anyway, I mean, I think what you end up with is essentially Bakunin was more intelligent than Marx ever was. Bakunin predicted all of this stuff essentially, and he said that it's all psychological, and Bakunin would have probably called Marx an idiot as well. I think he did call him an idiot, but that the problem is something like the human condition more than some kind of materialist narrative, um, and class consciousness, and that becomes a kind of quite a brittle and unwieldy kind of framework that is a bit too much of a an artificial overlay to be imposed, which is sort of almost as artificial as Marx's contemplation of the Joker card that culture plays and historical development, the role that those things take. I mean, there is something to the almost the idealist notion that, well, these things have to be transcended, otherwise they're going to just recur in another form. But Marx, in some sense, did not invent those notions. Those are all Hegelian. Anyway, and so perhaps I should. I mean, I've sometimes referred to myself as a kind of Marxist. Maybe I should just refer to myself more so as a kind of Hegelian. Although I must say, perhaps I'm not well read enough to make any of these kinds of general claims, but because I'm not sure what Hegel's if I can't call myself a Hegelian depending on other epistemological commitments he might have, but I do think that they that Hegel might be somewhat fluid or you would still be capable of calling yourself a Hegelian, because I imagine that Hegel's philosophy is all about the kind of is not necessarily about a priori commitments, but is more about understanding that a posterior process of something that we inherit from the a priori thing, which projects itself as a kind of process of idealism that participates in sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, sort of cycles. So Hegel is just describing a verb. In philosophy, he's not describing, he's not grounding that necessarily in an a priori schema, although I imagine that he certainly probably tried to infer and tried to investigate it on some level, but I imagine that one might be able to call oneself, anyway, I'm somewhat speculating, but sorry, this is completely irrelevant. So what is my point here? So, I mean, look, I don't, my own moral position on things is that I'm a non-racialist and I'm a non-sexualist, and I believe in equality in the way of equality of opportunity and essentially a kind of equality of access. There are actually philosophical problems with even the phrase equality of opportunity, because anyway, that's another kettle of fish to talk about. But suffice to say is that, if you try to make certain kinds of abstract commitments, you end up folding yourself into a very strange sort of existential narrative that is related to some kind of external locus of which sadly does make itself open for trading your envy for some kind of categorical jealousy that the narrative holds up as a kind of fundamental feature of reality, and so you've got something like an automatic invigilator or inquisitor that that you can go and invoke and let loose on somebody else, instead of actually sort of having to reason with them or negotiate, or so you kind of lose a kind of independence. Anyway, I shouldn't be talking about this. This is so all over the place, but that's such a tricky subject, because I would like to think that the kinds of justice and enforcement that I think is necessary in a society is one in which if time were not a constraint, and you had, sort of an infinite amount of latitude to actually go and investigate and negotiate and communicate, and work out what the optimum solution was, that essentially it would amount into that kind of procedural line of philosophical structure that the jurisprudence, sort of is responsive to. Obviously, procedurally, there are always going to be somewhat imperfections, because you don't have the ability to freeze the whole universe and then go and make infinite inquiries, but you try to have a qualitative procedural opportunity so that you man, it's so hard to even make analogies here, that and I'm talking too off the cuff perhaps, and this is also a bit of a this is a rabbit hole, but yeah, no, I'm really philosophizing quite laterally here. Let me find my topic again. Is there anything else? There were three other points that I wanted to say. The problem is that these points are a bit ephemeral, so they don't really, I can't really state them so concisely. One of the points was that um, uh, to curtail some of the issues that I was getting into, there is something really quite profound and coherent about non-racialism and non-sexualism, because that is not to say that differences in sex have no bearing, or differences in race have no bearing, but the question is that they have no moral weight. That you cannot institutionalize any kind of morally charged differentiation on that basis. So you don't have to be committed to the claim that there is no difference between the median of this race and the median of some other race. I mean, how could you expect those things to perfectly line up? The point is that it doesn't matter. It's not a useful question. It's not a morally, I mean, maybe it's worth asking that question if you are in the medical profession and there is some value you can extract from that quantification, because then you can do something to do with medical procedures, or you can do something with protocols or something. It's not as if you can't get maybe some utility from it. You see the nuance there. So and so, I mean, to put a practical spin on this is why you say, well, we need firefighters, but to be a good firefighter, you have to overcome this obstacle course with this amount with this amount of gear on your back that weighs X amount, because firefighters have to run into buildings with very heavy equipment on their back, and and certain women that are on average shorter than men are going to not be able to perform as well. They're not going to be able to get through that obstacle course, and therefore they should not be hired at the same rate as men. Maybe they also won't be as interested to apply, and so we should not worry that the fire station is manned with less women than men, because then if we include women, then we're just going to have a lot of dead firefighters because of smoke inhalation, because their lung capacity is on average smaller. So it's no victory to have extra women in the firefighting station. This is the kind of feeble vanity and stupefying, frivolity that we get, with these crazy, unprincipled, valueless, moral code enforcers that have no moral backbone, no real integrity. Just hysterical, emotional narrative dramatization. But yeah, you get this this very strange sort of I think what it almost comes down to, and this again is almost a sociological observation, is that men get praise when they perform highly because they have actually elevated their standing quite substantially when they perform meritoriously. When a man is honored for their meritorious service or performance, it's actually quite significant. And it's really quite significant in some sense in the sexual marketplace, as it were. Because the difference between a male with social standing and a male without social standing, let's say historically, evolutionary within our species, is the difference between a male that gets to leave their genes behind and a male that doesn't get to pass on their genes and reproduce and have children. It's quite a big, substantial thing because, in some sense, a male just being part of a society does not have a guarantee, like a woman does, of passing on their genes. They don't have the biological capital. And so when a man performs well and receives praise, their relative social standing inflates quite radically. They go from zero to hero. When it's quite important that men perform. Otherwise, in some sense, they don't necessarily earn the calories that they consume, whereas women automatically deserve the calories that they consume because we have just inherited that in our social convention. Because a society that keeps good care of the female population is much more resilient because the men can die and be disposable and can die in skirmishes and battles and fights. But as long as all the women survive, in one generation, the disposable male component of the population won't make a difference to the health of, as long as they were capable of protecting the women of their tribe, the tribe is still as successful. But the converse is not true. A tribe that expends females and that makes females disposable will be very susceptible to being displaced and outnumbered in a few generations by tribes that do the other strategy. So there's a selective pressure that has, I mean, this is one way of sort of modeling it or whatever. I'm just, giving some kind of explanation as to why there's a rational explanation to the kinds of sentiments that we have, the kind of conditioning that we might have that our culture has inherited. Now, in some sense, another way of saying this is that there's a much lighter selective pressure placed on women. Whereas there's a much heavier burden of selective pressure placed on men. And this means that men really do have to achieve, and let's say the variance of male proficiency is much more varied, is much more broad. And so, again, when men, distinguish themselves, they have eclipsed a lot of other men by doing so. And that is, again, if someone sees that happening in real time, if a girl sees a boy in their class go through that, there's less upward mobility for the girl, because just in terms of societal sentiment and conventional ways of framing value. And so, and women and girls especially, I think the problem is that they are automatically entitled to that amount of attention to begin with. But they almost don't even see necessarily that differential, or whenever I'm talking about this, the person who I always think about is Emma Watson, because listening to her complain about the male peers that she had and how she felt so hard done by because the male peers couldn't tolerate her because she was so special and even better than they were, and so they ostracized her, when she couldn't have imagined that maybe they ostracized her because she was an overbearing, entitled person who was incapable of sharing and playing nicely with her peers. That it couldn't have been that she had a kind of character defect. It had to be, it's because the boys were systemically oppressing her. It's sort of, it couldn't be because she didn't know how to break the ice, or she couldn't negotiate or kind of fashion any kind of way of inducting herself into a group setting, or forging any kind of bond with someone, is because she has to address the group as a group. She can't ever address the individual components of a group and bond with people one-on-one or anything like that. It's because the group has to give her a certain automatic identity and a bestowed amount of prestige or status. And if they're not willing to provide the status that she expects, then it's because the group is unjust. It's this disgusting kind of social politics. No individualism except for her own. You can imagine how someone like that would be essentially an overbearing. Anyway, I'm somewhat imagining half of this, but it's not as if I didn't know girls who were like this, which I think to some degree might be inculcated in girls because they spend so much time plotting social manipulation with their dolls and their doll houses, and their imagining of narratives playing out and how people must be cajoled by having to conform to the unfolding of a plot. All of which somewhat, I think, erode the kind of the one-on-one camaraderie or one-on-one interrelation, and let's say that there's a very little personable dimension in the I mean, I think narcissists have this as well. Narcissists can't relate on the level of personability. They can only relate to status and um, cultural settings and social expectations, and they have a very refined even codex about how these things, how this translates to that, and how that should lead to that expectation, and how these things should basically line up. A whole lot of triggered reactive expectations and tripwires and conventions to rely on and invoke. Anyway, but yeah, but those kinds of narcissistic relations are a very common feature of a lot of cluster B type psychopathologies, because you need to have some basic framework and container through which to be able to extract the kind of sadistically edged exploitation and projection and sort of drama games and narrative inception. You have to have some kind of rubric so that the hooks can be attached. Anyway, somewhat I can't even remember the word, but that means that when you're talking and you're just talking endlessly about things that are a bit fluffy and it's not going anywhere, I'm waffling. I mean, I guess what all those themes have in common is that there's no self-awareness, and that might also be because essentially there's no self. Oh, that's the element that I wanted to talk about, which is consistent in this identitarian wokeness movement, is that there are no boundaries between the personal, intimate, and the public identity. That is, and this is also why I think that sexuality is so horribly misfigured in this new epoch. Why people's sexuality and whatever practices that there's no intimacy connected with their sex, because this political vehicle of the identity is an expression of intimacy. That there's no gradation between, no, that's private, I'm connecting my private thoughts with privately to people in the bedroom, and then when I go into society I wear my societal mask and I put on my professional hat, and I wear the hat and I wear the garb of the role of where I am in the time and place. And there's another time and place called the bedroom for intimacy. They don't have those layers and boundaries. Instead, the political vehicle is an expression of sexual energy. And in some sense, it's very hard to trick people out of authentic sexuality. People have a need for intimacy. But how you do it, and how people have culturally indoctrinated people into doing this, and this relates to my sociological description, is that you first exploit other people's sexual energy. So it's girls getting to exploit the sexual energy and preferences of males, that they get to ideologically prescribe to them how they should redirect their preferences to aid in the liberation of all identities, or something like that, and a social justice for the identity matrix. And so that dehumanization of male sexuality then, which is also the fuel for the radical ideological imagination, then is the vehicle for how they excoriate, how they vilify male sexual energy, is at the same time an expression, because you don't just say it's bad, you say why it's bad. And when you're saying why it's bad, you are projecting why the male sexual energy has already stopped the utopia from manifesting, and why it has already prevented the victim from expressing or from enjoying their own self-esteem in a particular way. So when you make that critique, not only are you exploiting masculine sexual energy, but you are having to express your own intimate desire, but you're doing it in a political identitarian valence. So your self-conception doesn't have boundaries or layers. It's all there. It's all naked. Your political vehicle of your identity becomes an expression of your sexual, basically, intimacy. And this is why I think that, and look, there's going to be a mix of this, because not some people will perhaps have compartmentalized their sexuality and maybe be able to keep some kind of healthy sexuality, but have a lot of ideological cognitive dissonance. So there are going to be lots of subtypes in a spectrum of this. But I would say that, and this also explains what I would call, and I mean, I hate using these kinds of stereotypes, but just to make a long story short, this is why I think that there were all these stereotypes about Germans very much into dominatrix and kinky sex, but Germans and dominatrixes. And I think that the reason why that there's this connection between Germans and dominatrixes is because the dominatrix is a kind of authoritarian dictator that is just exerting control over you and is infantilizing you while meting out punishment against you, and that in some sense is maybe, it's ambiguous. Is it designed to bring you joy? Is it for your own good? Is the pain caused by love, or is it caused by contempt? It's sort of, you don't know. It's veiled by the mask of the dominatrix, by the role of the dominatrix. And that ambiguity of control, is it just about the control, or is there love with the control? Is the mystery of the dominatrix, perhaps? And I would say that that is the totalitarian political drama narrative. And so I believe that when you don't have a healthy intimacy, because you don't have real boundaries between intimacy and your public identity, you're wearing your intimacy on your sleeve or something like that, then how that intimacy that you wear on your sleeve, how your political vehicle of identitarian politics is cosmologically understood, or the narrative and all those sorts of things, means that when you actually do experience sex and intimacy, the only way that you can connect to it is if you dramatize, because this is what I think intimacy, I didn't introduce this properly. My view of intimacy is that people, in their deepest form of intimacy, they are reconstructing their ego. They are experiencing the themes that have to do, that underpin and undergird the structure of their ego. And so to truly share an intimacy bubble with someone is that you are sharing, and this is why intimacy facilitates pair bonding, is because you are remaking yourself. You are almost being reborn in the presence of them. They are seeing you being They are seeing you emerge. You are reliving the formation of your ego inside the intimacy bubble so that you can recode yourself as well. You can tweak yourself. You can give yourself a bit of an update or whatever, but you also know that you're being witnessed by the person who is sharing the intimacy bubble. Now, this is in some sense what the identitarian is doing they are doing this on the political stage. They're doing this in public. They have taken that, which should be a personal thing, and they have turned it into a political thing. So it's a kind of sex addiction that is on a political stage. Okay, so there's that element to it. And then there's the element of that. Then what do you do when you're actually then in the bedroom with someone? Well, then the only thing that you can do is you can engage in the same thing, but instead of the intimacy being sophisticated and nuanced and deep, instead it becomes vulgar and crude. It becomes an exemplification of the thing that you do in the political identitarian sphere. So the only way that you experience sex, because sex is less intimate than your actual activism. Sex is less intimate than your actual fucking intimism. So all you can do when you have real sexual intimacy then is make a simulacra of the thing that you're already doing politically. Now, I would also say that there are ways in which this also kind of happens in a different variant, and also happens similarly in a slightly different variant in reverse, which is that, and you can see elements of sex. This happens, or I've seen it represented in media and things like that, that people will go and have a very interesting day at work, or they'll have a very strange thing that happens to them. In the movie Monster, the character played by Halle Berry, whose son dies because of a racist cop, and then the racist cop, I think, sort of molests her. I can't remember the whole plot of the movie and in which order it happened, but I think at one point she actually ends up sleeping with that cop because they've kind of trauma bonded to some degree. But anyway, the point that I'm making is that that you can be, let's say, in your real life, people with some proper intimacy bubbles or intimacy distinctions between intimacy and their other sides of their life, that they can be mystified, or they can be set upon and not understand how to cope with the other parts of their life, and then they can find a way to maybe implant that or translate that into their intimacy bubble and to explore it in their intimacy bubble. And I'm not doing this topic so much justice. I've explained this in other recordings. So anyway, there are other elements out there about this. But my basic point is that because intimacy is very close to the root of your being in terms of seeing behind the veil, behind the curtain of your ego formation. So I don't want to put too much psychological jargon into this recording, but essentially it's all about the superego. What is my point? Anyway, I guess I was just making a tangent about about how that same dynamic kind of works in reverse. But for the identitarian woke person, I mean, in some senses, it's always been known that, for example, borderline personality disorder is sort of an extremely hypersexual uh, psychopathology. Anyway, and although, anyway, I'm showing how this works in a kind of ideological form. And let me just say that there are some differences between actual borderline personality disorder and, let's say, this ideological variant of the same thing. It is not exactly the same, but the parallels are huge. But it is a bit sophisticated in terms of how it gets paralleled, because it's it's more like the identitarian category itself is the borderline, and even the proponents of the ideology themselves are like cerebral histrionics, but there are some cerebral histrionics which are more like Führers themselves. They are like queen bees. And then there are others who are more sort of beta flying monkeys. And so you kind of have, you could probably make a catalog and call them, sort of alphas, betas, and, so, I'm sorry, I'm trying to think of some alien movie where they sort of characterize three different types of the alien, sort of enemy, but, it's something like that. And it does kind of operate as a hive as well. So, there are lots of, there are lots of layers to this. Uh, and how this intersects with gender politics, as it were, is also, I think, slightly incidental, but it's worth just explaining it and talking about it. And there's more that I could say about the actual sort of sexual component as well, because I believe that that kind of sex is very uh, destructive of healthy male sexual energy. It is sort of the antithesis of male sexual energy. Um, because it's completely disconnected from any kind of, you are literally being a prop in a broader narrative. You are literally being there as a stand-in for some figure, for some ulterior figure, or some generalized generic sort of environmental force. Although, I mean, that can also happen in healthy sexuality, but in some sense that's a kind of playful enactment, that's a kind of role play or something like this. This crude role play that I'm talking about is not a role play, it's a reenactment. Perhaps I'm not making a proper qualified distinction here, but that's, I think, the easiest way to kind of express it, at least quickly. But let me think of the other elements of it that are worth pointing out. And essentially there's a kind of now again, I'm in some sense I'm talking about the apex of dysfunction. So there are many people that might not have reached this level of sexual dysfunction, but I think that this is the tendency of the things that will deteriorate or erode the actual sexual. This will be the kind of the cultural spiraling downfall. It's going to tend towards these properties and features that I'm explaining. But essentially that, especially because of the feminist kind of scapegoat of the male, that, so also what I was saying earlier, I was actually saying that essentially that the male is going to be always treated as the dominatrix. So they're going to be the masked figure, as it were. Actually, no, maybe that's not even true. Maybe that could go either way, that feature, and how it's explored within the crude intimacy bubble of identitarians. But just the male, if this is a heterosexual coupling, just the male component of it is going to have at least this other pressure of that, and I don't really mean pressure, I mean they're going to have this other horrible layer of experience in that they are going to be witnessed. They are going to be monitored, that they don't extract some kind of toxic masculinity, which would essentially be anything like normal male sexual energy, that they don't exude or exhibit or participate in any way that isn't somehow representatively denigrating of their whole collective guilt. So they are going to be monitored to show the right amount of contrition of collective guilt. And even if they're not being actively, what's the word? I mean, I imagine this might be a whole spectrum or whatever, but even if that hasn't been explicitly laid down as a point of contention, or as a rule of something not to cross, it's going to be an unspoken standard or memory that is going to be at some point paid for, or at some point made to answer for, or going to have some consequence attached to it. So in some sense, that's going to be a kind of meta-sexual thread of the relationship, is that no healthy expression of sexual energy to go unpunished, essentially. And so there's going to be a kind of a political sexual project, or a political activist identitarian conscious, part of the normal everyday life of these people is going to be at some point there denigrating and diminishing whatever lively or healthy sexual energy is being expressed or indulged in by the male in the intimacy sphere. So the wick is going to be burning from both ends, essentially, until it's sort of going to meet in the middle, or something like that. And this is, I imagine, what leads to all these liberal lefty people having all these very dysfunctional, sort of rapey things, and because they are being expected to walk a tightrope, somewhat with the anticipation that they're going to at some point be rewarded, but the whole thing is a sort of mechanical sort of paradox. Sorry, I've used the wrong word. I can't think of the word that I wanted to use, but because it's going to, the expectation is going to be that the self-denial is going to correlate to some kind of ideological sympathy that is going to be meted out and fed to them. And so when that doesn't perhaps manifest, then there's going to be a kind of narcissistic rage that's going to be inculcated. So, I mean, anyway, these little martyrs, or these stupid beta males that are trying to be good flying monkeys, are going to be tortured until they become, very dangerous psychopaths, or overt, sort of sociopaths, or they're going to be very unhinged. Maybe they'll be used as sort of like the Joker fringe of the identitarian. They'll be funneled into the Antifa, sort of radicalization program, or whatever. They'll probably have some kind of use for their throwaway miscreants who, because somehow the only people that can actually function in this ideology are the people who sing the chorus and play along, and somehow, well, it just so happened that they're either very good looking, or they inherited lots of money, or they were a member of the royal family, and so they had automatic prestige and status, and so they kind of had a built-in social capital that was capable of making them special enough for a woman to hypergamously attach themselves to. And that gives them the, so you have this very, you end up with a social structure that has sort of no meritocratic upward mobility available to it. It's under the weight of its own sort of ideological craziness and contradiction. There's a frozen ladder where everyone is kind of strangely atomized and isolated into obsessing over the identitarian narrative as the only means towards negotiating or extracting social justice. So it's sort of, you have to be starved so that everyone has to hunger only for social justice. There's no other metric of growth or development, or self-improvement, or um, uh, uh, aspiration. There's no other aspirational mode. And that again is, that's another aspect of this whole sort of grift, and this whole sort of game, is that you get locked into their narrative spell and their metrics of conflating and reducing everything into those particular dimensions. And you're not allowed to think outside of that rubric. Outside of that dogma and canon. So you have a really twisted and contorted view of agency, that agency was already set because you have the collective agency of your identitarian faction, and that is the only agency that exists, the agency that belongs to identity, not to the individual. That, I think, is a good overarching way of understanding it as an arbitrary containment mechanism over agency, but one that precipitates a very particular and convenient kind of abstractly or cerebrally, it gives you a kind of instrumentalization that makes you think that you can solve every problem so much as you just proceed from those incorrect premises and contortion over the nature and basic value of agency. That as long as you allow agency to be conflated and reduced into the abstraction of the group identity, then suddenly the world becomes amenable to being mediated over and arbitrated over by a systematic plan of but it all rests on the scapegoat's back, essentially. And the problem is that the scapegoat does not actually have endless capacity to support grievances and accusations and claims made against it. That's also sort of, without that scapegoat writing the blank check, the whole thing falls apart. So that has to also be obscured quite heavily by continuous hysterical conspiracy theories. And so the whole game is so brittle that it actually requires quite a lot of thought control and manipulation just to keep the bandwagon on the road. It's so committed to keeping itself above water and moving forward, and the fire growing, that its proponents are often very desperate because they think that it's on the edge of being extinguished, or that it's not growing healthily enough always. So it's sort of they are propelled, they're on the brink constantly. And let's say the ideological taxation, the internal ideological taxation, it's not a free addiction, as it were. It's a costly addiction. And they are conscious of that cost, and they feel that it confers a virtue onto them. So, it's got all of these measures of conformism and sort of compliance checking and weird kinds of congruence. And I mean, a lot of it operates really as a groupthink. It really is as a hive kind of creature, which makes sense because a lot of the ideology is that the moral consideration vests in the health and the pride contained by the group pride, which is the source of moral consideration, and in some sense also sort of morally is where agency needs to be empowered. So the agency of the identity needs to be empowered, which means that naturally the agency of the individual needs to be crushed and displaced by that former conception of agency, which is obviously an oxymoron. It's paradoxical. You can't have a group being agentic without the individual components being agentic. So, and therefore they have their own sort of mechanism of conformity. So it's a slave morality is another way of putting it. And Nietzsche described it perfectly as a slave morality, and it's just another variant of the same thing, in short. So, yeah. I think the sooner we understand what it is, but more importantly, the sooner we're capable of structurally creating values and principles and institutions that carry values and principles and procedures that can extricate or segregate us from it, that's the only real solution. It's really quite that simple. You need to see them in the reflection of a shield. That's the only way to combat them, is you need to see them in the reflection of the aegis. So I just want to finish the sort of the conclusion of the arc of what I was sort of getting at talking about. I mean, I don't like talking about these sort of stereotypes, but they do have some value in terms of how people, you have to understand some things on like a low resolution model of reality, so that it and then before you understand the more nuanced, sophisticated things. So it doesn't help just to talk about the sophisticated, nuanced version. It does help to kind of say it in a rudimentary way. And so what I'm getting at talking about these differences between the sexes and things like that is that basically when it comes to morality, you cannot think that the basic component or the basic constituent, that the citizen essentially, cannot be conceived of as female. It's in low resolution form. You have to think of the average component of an organization as essentially being male, to strip it of this kind of, let's say, this female privilege. So I mean, I guess you could say that you don't have a well-ordered, integrated society once you have baked in these kinds of asymmetries, and in some sense there is there's something about, let's say, the archetypal feminine which is dependent on exploiting a kind of male disposability. And so if you want to actually have a system that has real integrity, that has a kind of structural framework, that has proper processes, that have real values and principles etched into them, that isn't just contrived or orchestrated around a narrative, you have to sort of posit every person as essentially, in terms of stereotyping, as essentially being a kind of male constituent part of the system, because then and that's essentially just to have something like a meritocracy. So archetypally, the meritocracy is populated by something like the male standard of 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 um, of because there's something sort of fundamentally double standardish about how women often relate to structures and systems. And that is not to say that all women must relate to structures and systems in this way, but that is sort of the hypergamous exploitative sexual strategy. And so men and women have different, let's say, perverse incentives. And how the female perverse incentive functions is that it games structures, it games conventions. And the way to guard against that is you have systems and structures that aren't conventional, that are just inherited or residue. They are actually principled and proceed from first principles and have and are are operative around values that are substantive. That's how you guard against it. And so that has a kind of male stereotype or motif about it. And, if you ever want to sort of confirm this kind of low resolution stereotyping, just talk to a feminist activist or a feminist ideologue. It's all narrative. It's not it doesn't have any coherent reasoning and values underpinning it. The values are all double standards and inconsistent and bring circular reasoning and contradictions and fudged things where you can't continue to reason about it, because then it very quickly falls on itself. So yeah, so the way you get out of that is you do basically say that the common frame of reference, the common standards or whatever, is in some stereotypical sense and there are many females that are enculturated into that. Is a kind of, I mean, although I've just portrayed it now as a stereotype, but there's no reason why culturally that has to pertain only to males. I'm just saying that framework, which you could say archetypally exalts the healthy masculine, is, let's say, the operative, driving, propitiative force of self-propulsion, of self-ownership, of self-determinism, of agency comporting itself into a structure in which other people's agency has to be respected and coordinated with. That is somehow more archetypally masculine than it is feminine, for the reasons that I've illustrated and have talked about in terms of the sexual strategies. And I mean, it's something has to do with that women are. It's more important for a woman to be certain about who she trusts. But men are much more plugged in to, if I'll put it in this way, the world of integrity. Because if there isn't integrity in the structures that the male has to conform to or fit within, or try to gain high status within the structures thereof, if there isn't real integrity there, then they're going to be disposable for no good reason. Then the male disposability will not have an efficacious return on them. And there is, let's say, there is an incentive for males to try to have a system that's transparent enough, that has enough integrity, that when it does indulge in male disposability for the group, because that is what conserves the group in some maximum degree, that is what confers the group some advantage, but that algorithm or that tactic within the successful strategy is not being contorted into a mindless or fruitless sacrifice. That it is actually that sacrifice that is done that confers honor on the people who vie for high social status, that the actual social status is reflective of a system that has real integrity behind it. Because it's the male that's on the chopping block, as it were. And it is the female that is automatically protected and preserved. And so the hypergamous strategy and manipulation using conventions, if that becomes a cultural hegemon, then you lose the ability to sort of reality check the integrity of the structure. So you trade trust for integrity, and that is archetypally a feminine thing. And when it happens so extensively, it produces what could be called, sort of the devouring mother, or the toxic sort of feminine thing. But the problem is that it's it's quite an abyss. But again, I mean, these things aren't necessarily female. I mean, you can draw correlations to this in a kind of sociological analogy, but, you know, these at the end of the day can all be tracked into people's actual mentalities, their actual beliefs, their ideology, how they relate to culture, and the content of culture itself. And individuals are, at the end of the day, the gatekeepers of all of culture go through individuals. And you can say, oh, yes, well, we have to conform and comport to the general sort of thing. But as soon as any even two people can set up a dynamic that models an alternative, you have a viable, sociologists play this game on people usually in the first sort of lecture of sociology, where they say, well, what's stopping you from standing up on a table and taking off all of your clothes? It's the, I can't remember all the phrases, but, you know, it's the social constructivism, it's the pressure. And in some sense, what stops people in a room from changing all of society? What's holding them back? And the truth is that it's actually slightly incorrect to say it's me against society. It's not exactly an individual against society. It's slightly broader than that, because it's what is possible between more than an individual. What is possible between two people? Because it's not the individual against the room. It's whatever version of us can be constructed in real time, fueled by people's endorsement, their agentic endorsement and agency, into an us. It's us against the room. And the question is, do you have the power to join an us? Yes, you do. Do you have a power to create an us and to construct an us? Yes, you do. So it's the power is in that form of creation. The individual creates those things, can create those things. But if you're disempowered and you say, well, it's just me against society, well, yeah, it's because you're not in the contestation for influence and control, because it's not about creating. So, I mean, you know, when Jordan Peterson is talking about individualism, when I'm talking about individual values, I'm talking about a version of an us, a version of how a constitution of values that can be shared and collectively believed in, as it were, as a template, as a model for culture, which is the conduit and the medium through which individuals can interact with one another. And in some sense, you know, technically, the way that is power is that if it has the ability to discern between those who comport and those who do not comport, and it has the ability to convince those who do not comport, or it has the ability to dissuade or to segregate itself away from those who do not comport to that culture, that is how influence and culture would actually manifest. Is, do you have a stringent enough value system that empowers people to discern and to substantiate or defend, or how able does it make you? How, or, you know, sort of how confining is the mentality? And I mean, this is also a kind of philosophical and existential kind of question, because a lot of nihilistic people will say, well, it doesn't matter what you understand. Thinking doesn't matter. Beliefs don't matter. You know, the only thing that matters is something like reproduction or genetics, or some kind of overt political control, or weapons or violence, or something, or it's all just a game, or it's all just virtual. But you know, as it's said in scripture, those who live by the sword die by the sword. Those who live by the Spirit will die if they give up their spirit, if they if they don't overcome, if they don't have victory over the world. and it is a spiritual victory, and it is a spiritual battle, and some people, they care about an understanding, because they know that, I mean, I don't want to get too theological here, but when the ancients said the heart, and when it's said in Scripture that the law is written on your heart, the ancients, people from 2,000 years ago, they didn't have the scientific obsession with the brain. Even the Egyptians, they thought that the brain was basically just a kind of, it was full of snot or something like that, that it was just, what as an organ, the brain was scooped out with a hook and put into a jar, where the heart was very craftily excised. The brain was just maybe like a switchboard of connective tissue in some network, but the actual intelligence was in the chest. The actual wisdom and faith was in the chest. So the heart was really the heart of the intellect, the heart of faith, the heart of understanding. That your will, your impulsive force to do things, not your emotionality, but your intellect was in your chest. That's where your force of will issues from. So, if we wanted to modernize the heart, we would really point to the head and say it's your heart of understanding. And this gets you very far away then from the pagan sky father vicarious redemption, sort of father in the sky, sort of, which I do think is a sort of a pagan perversion of the Judeo-Christian God. But because God, in this sense, is somewhere in the chest, is somewhere in the intellect, is somewhere within the faculty of one's faith. It's not in the world, or depending on what sort of spin, well, is certainly not a part of the world, but is in the world through being channeled by everybody's faith in some sense, and it is both a judge of fallen faith as well as a properly attuned faith. So the ability of God to judge the heart is a kind of, becomes an emergent, let's say, witness of God in the world, but that's not the that I would argue is connected with the Holy Ghost, which is a kind of philosophical thing, which is even why it's called the Holy Ghost, is not how you're supposed to experience the divine. You can't unmask the Holy Ghost, essentially, and in some sense the Holy Ghost is understood as being the keeper of a certain forbidden knowledge. Even in Scripture, how it's explained is that you have peace, joy, and contentment in the Holy Ghost, that you live in the Holy Ghost. So you understand it as how you are orientated within a kind of a priori philosophical metaphysic and sort of existentialist bounded thing, because if you knew what you looked like in the future, then that would displace God. If you knew the future, if you had future knowledge of yourself, and yourself is in the image of God, so if you knew the image of yourself in the future, you become automatically a slave to it. And so instead you live in the Holy Ghost, and then that is forbidden to you. You don't know yourself in the future. You don't conjure that idolatry. That is peace, joy, and contentment in the Holy Ghost. Is you know what is forbidden that keeps you capable of worshipping the living God, which in some sense is more the personal God of the Father, which is also the Father to all, which is how then you operate in the caste of that everyone has the ability to attain the Christ consciousness, that the sons of God, but there is only one begotten Son, and that is the culture of how then we comport ourselves in a spiritual communion. But anyway, I don't want to get too much into theological sort of talking about this. But 1 John chapter 4 and chapter 5 is very clear that this is vicarious redemption is not the doctrine. Anyway, other people that are familiar with my recordings, probably sick of listening to this being repeated. But anyway, I just wanted to make some kind of concise catalogue of ideas that are somewhat connected. But why was I talking about that when I was just talking about the low resolution? And there's an interesting parallel to this in Christian scripture, which is, that you have to solve the mystery, as it were, because you can't understand it all at once. It's too much of a huge topic. Spirituality has philosophical components. It's too much to understand. It cannot be digested. So that's why it's a mystery, so that you know that, okay, well, now I'm understanding the crucifix, and now I'm understanding Jesus Christ, and now I'm understanding the Trinity. So we have, and we know that they're all connected to one another, and that they all link and interrelate to one another. But if we keep on going into how they always interrelate, you never ever finish any one topic. So how do you talk about a topic that is never going to be resolved until you understand it all as an entire system? When it's too complicated, you have to reduce it into an allegory, into a mystery. And then in Revelations it says, and the mystery of God shall be finished. And even in 1 John chapter 5, I would say it even explicitly explains away God. God, the true spirit, love, and to understand the Trinity, that when these things are finally understood, what you're left with is an understanding. And that's exactly what it says in 1 John chapter 5. That it is this understanding is God and eternal life. That's what it says. And some people have the meekness to, and the spiritual need to look for that understanding, and others don't. Essentially, is also what. But anyway, those are huge topics in themselves to somewhat be expounded on. But let me stop pontificating ad hoc. Yeah, so I've gone down this rabbit hole, but what I really just wanted to say was that in a low resolution sort of way, you do have to kind of anchor a culture, at least archetypally, somewhat in the masculine form. But that, I think, can be obscured very quickly, or can be healthily obscured and eclipsed by just having an educated culture with real values and actual integrity. Then you don't need to do that. And, I do think that the apex of our culture was the Russian aristocracy and their romanticism, And I mean, I think that they essentially had a kind of equality. They had so much integrity. Um, anyway, that's and it was quite sad that after the Russian Revolution, essentially, the engine of Western civilization uh, was dismantled, and I don't think Western civilization has really recovered from that. Um, but Western Europe was, I think, largely an imitator of the high culture that was being produced in Russian high society. And obviously, it's not ideal when only a certain section of the population could have the kind of aristocracy large enough, but also on the backs of serfdom, to have, let's say, the luxury to indulge into that kind of cultural production. But I do think that this is the opportunity that we have in the modern era, if we can return to modernity, essentially. Um, but with something of a renewed spirit in, the basic philosophy or philosophical commitment to self-determinism. Which is essentially this is getting very, very long, but the epistemic agency in understanding that I choose, I endorse these values, I infuse them with my epistemic agency. Uh, that is the kind of affirmative culture of the living. And that is really the thing that sets apart a living culture from, sort of an inherited sort of collection of residue that has only sort of reactive propensities, and, sort of a kind of instrumentalism waiting to receive some captive inductance. Oh, attendance that are sold some lie about feeling special to having to attend to this uh, inherited contrivance that they don't understand. And that is really the love of the darkness, the love of not understanding. And that has been the root of evil that has perennially flourished in each epoch. And that is what has always tarnished and led to the ashened remains and the scattered uh, hopes and crushed dreams and cycles of just, sort of mediocrity. Um, the tumult of the sea, uh, that has cleared the beaches and swept them clean in each generation, grinding down the sand castles. And you know, there's only one rock that can withstand that, and that is the rock of self-determinism, of I choose, of epistemic agency. And once we have a justice system and procedural structures and jurisprudence and philosophy and political structures that basically respect these things and build those things into responsive levers and instruments and rights and powers of the individual citizen, then you will have an edifice that is capable of reproducing itself, of conserving itself, of reproducing its integrity, and not just the manufacture or fabrication of a trust that is unearned and that is capable of being an inheritance to the next generation. It's simply not enough. As soon as we can stop being enthralled with these dead things and we can digest them properly in a living culture, the better. Obviously, I'm not promoting a kind of a harsh, cataclysmic revolution or anything like that. Obviously, you need time to evaluate and to salvage perhaps the gems between the brine of the dead seas that contain so much conquered life. That there are things to be salvaged, one could say resurrected. Anyway, I think I've waffled on for long enough.